At 8:46 on September 11, 2001, the world was transformed. A plane struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. When a second plane hit the South Tower, America's national security team understood there was nothing accidental about the events. The news quickly reached the ear of the President of the United States as he sat ready to read to a classroom full of students at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. The messenger, Andy Card, Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. From that day forward, Mr. Card witnessed the president's calm, unflinching response behind closed doors and in front of a watching world. On today's State of Independence, we'll explore how a president's faith can strengthen his responsibilities in office and how that same faith inspires unity in the midst of distrust and division. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us today. 3 days after the attacks on 9/11, President Bush stood in the stone pulpit of the National Cathedral to lead the nation in mourning the fallen victims of a calculated, devastating sneak attack on American soil. At that moment, the nation was at its most vulnerable point since the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor 6 decades earlier. Bush ended his remarks with a New Testament passage from St. Paul. As we've been assured, neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth can separate us from God's love. May He bless the souls of the departed, may He comfort our own, and may He always guide our country. For Bush, faith wasn't just a national creed, it was personal. When asked who his favorite philosopher was while campaigning for the presidency, he answered, Christ, because he changed my heart. But in a nation where the lines between church and state are often debated, what is the role of Christian faith in the White House? Is it something that should be private and separate from the president's decisions? Or if faith is traditionally understood to be essential to life, should it publicly impact one's choices? In other words, is there room for faith in the White House? Today on State of Independence, I'll be asking these questions to my good friend, Secretary Andrew Card, former Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. But first, watch this.
In a moment of national crisis, where do America's leaders find the steadiness and resolve to guide millions of Americans? How do they shape the message that prevents panic and directs the national response while guiding its moral direction? Where do presidents find the words to calm, to inspire, to heal? Is a president's character shaped before, during, or after moments of great decision? And what about the role of a president's personal faith? What about prayer? Is it formal? Is it personal? Or both? One man was behind closed doors. He was eyewitness to an American president's response during moments of deep national testing. He abandoned his own ambitions to serve another's, a shadow to history. Secretary Andrew Card, eyewitness to faith and the presidency.
Andy Card, thank you so much for joining me here today on State of Independence. It is great to see you, as always.
John Watkins, it is a privilege to be with you. You're kidding me? This is such a privilege, and you've been such an influential person in my life, so I'm honored to be on the show with you.
Thank you so much. For the audience, you should know that I met Andy Card years ago during the transition for President George Herbert Walker Bush. This is back in 1988. In early '89, before we started the White House, and then of course I had the privilege to Andy is kind to say to work with him, but I actually was one of the people that worked for him. He was Deputy Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush in that White House before becoming Chief of Staff to George W. Bush in that White House, and so we've known each other for a long time. My daughter had the good pleasure to work with you as well in the George W. Bush White House. And we just count it a privilege to know you. We just love your heart and your spirit, and you've always been a kind, decent human being, and a straight shooter too, which we just love. So Andy, it's just thanks for being here. So let's talk. I just want to, 45 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been that long, but 45 years ago, you became a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So you started out as a state. A lot of people don't know this about you. They don't know at one time you were an elected official, and you had your eyes set on elective politics. Isn't that right?
Well, first of all, I'm an engineer by training. And right after I graduated from engineering school at the University of South Carolina, I was married and had 2 kids. So we were appropriately struggling to survive. But I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be happy. I was very happy. And I actually ran for local office in my hometown, Holbrook, Massachusetts, where I met my wife in the 5th grade. We've now been married for over 53 years.
Yeah.
But I ran for the planning board in the town of Holbrook in 1971 and got elected to a 5-year term and served on a couple other boards in the town. And I didn't get any pay for it, but I ran for state representative and got elected in 1974 in Massachusetts, served for 8 years in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So I say I'm an engineer by training, but I was a politician by disease. I contracted the disease because my grandmother had been a militant suffragette. Yeah. She fought for women to get the right to vote. And she said the most important word in the Constitution is the very first word, we. And she said, when I was your age, we didn't apply to me. But it does apply to you. Now it applies to me as well. And we should accept the invitation that our Constitution gives us to be part of government, register to vote. Vote. If you have a chance, run for office, serve in office, and help our government. You're part of that government. So I grew up infected with that call to be part of our government and be part of the we, proudly part of the we.
So you met your wife. Your wife, by the way, for the audience, is a pastor. She pastors a church in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and which is wonderful. I too, as you know, am a pastor, along with the other things that I do. What role, and you've known her forever, what role did faith, Andy, play for you in all this? I mean, so you certainly had the calling from, the notion from your grandmother that this is something that you ought to do, it was the right thing to do, but did faith have a role at all in any of this?
Absolutely. I grew up, my home in Holbrook, Massachusetts was probably about 200 yards from the Congregational Church, Winthrop Congregational Church in Holbrook, Massachusetts. I was very, very active in that church. My parents were, my grandparents were, and my wife went to the Catholic Church about a half mile away. But as we were becoming good friends, and we were great friends long before we were boyfriend, girlfriend, certainly long before we were husband and wife, but she used to come to some of the activities at my church, and I used to go to some of the activities at her church. So faith was part of our growing up together, even though we had very different views on how we practiced our faith. And I would admit there's a lot of people that say Catholics and Protestants can't get along, and I witnessed that a few times, but I married a woman who was Catholic, and now she is a Methodist minister. So her journey in faith paralleled my journey in politics. And faith has been very important in our lives, and it continues to be. But I can honestly tell you, I wake up very early in the morning, 4:08, and people will say, why do you wake up at 4:08? And I said, I wake up at 4:08 because my wife inculcated me with Philippians 4:8. Think of all that is right and honorable and just and positive. Wake up with good feelings. And so we decided we were going to wake up every morning at 4:08, and I did. Lots of my friends say there are other Bible verses that start with 6.
That's right. Oh, that's a blessing. Well, so you helped George H.W. Bush in his presidential bid in 1980, and then of course the bug bit you again, and you were a candidate, as I recall, in 1982 for governor of Massachusetts.
It was a forgettable experience for almost everybody except for me and my wife, but I did much better than the pundits had predicted, and they had said that I wouldn't get more than 10% of the vote, and I got about 24% of the vote. And so I was, quote, a hidden winner. I can tell you it's much better to be a real winner, right. But I was a hidden winner. But I received a phone call a few days after I had lost in that Republican primary in 1982. And it was a remarkable phone call because it came from James A. Baker III, Jim Baker, who was chief of staff to President Ronald Reagan. And I had met him going all the way back in 1976, and he was very involved in George H.W. Bush's first campaign for the presidency in 1979 and 80. But he called me and asked, after I had lost in this Republican primary, if I'd like to come work for President Reagan at the White House. I accepted that invitation, kind of consistent with my grandmother saying the Constitution has got great invitations in it. Answer the invitation, accept the invitation to be involved. that's what brought me to Washington, D.C., and that changed my life. And I worked in the White House for President Ronald Reagan, first as a special assistant to the president, and then as deputy assistant to the president for intergovernmental affairs. And obviously, I was very close to Vice President Bush because I helped him in that early campaign in 79 and 80. And I was blessed to have had phenomenal opportunities. But
you did something that a lot of people aren't able to do. I mean, if you run for governor of a state or a commonwealth, the candidate for governor, especially if you're the nominee, if you end up being the nominee, those people are stars. They're the person, they're the guy, so to speak. And to go from being the star, or at least a candidate for governor, and then to serve a president, I mean, it really takes a special kind of heart to do that. I mean, just like you've known George W. Bush for so many years, and personally, and yet and still when you work for him in the White House, you didn't call him George or W. You called him Mr. President.
To this day, I call him President Bush. Yes, I've known him. I was much closer to his parents. People think I must have been really close friends with George W. Bush. I was much closer to his parents, and I believe his parents probably whispered in his ear that he should consider me for chief of staff, because I did not know that he was considering me to be his chief of staff. But I can tell you, I was so impressed with George H.W. Bush and how he lived his life, and Barbara Bush, and they were a great inspiration. But George W. Bush, I witnessed a transformation. And I like to say he's one of the most disciplined men I ever met. And that when I first met him, most of the discipline was coming from his mother.
Right.
I witnessed how he accepted self-discipline after he enhanced his relationship with Jesus Christ as our Lord. And he went to Bible study. He found a right path. And I can tell you that I was so impressed with the discipline that he had to find strength through faith, as he had to be making unbelievably challenging decisions as president.
I have to tell you one thing, Andy. I worked in that campaign in 1988 for President George H.W. Bush as well. I was just one of the people, nameless, faceless people working the campaign. But I remember seeing George W. Bush, who was working the campaign, very serious, very hardworking, very much on message and point for his father in that campaign. But in 1988, if you had queried anybody at the campaign, or even national Republicans, about who might emerge, in a couple of cycles as the next nominee for the presidency of the United States, who there would have said George W. Bush? I think nobody, right?
Nobody. If they had mentioned any other Bush name, it would have been Jeb Bush.
Exactly. Yeah.
But George W. exceeded expectations. Remember, he ran for Congress and lost. And then he was very successful in the business world and running a baseball team, the Texas Rangers. But then he ran for governor, and a lot of people thought, oh, he's not going to have much of a chance. But he was very disciplined. He worked very hard, and he won an important race for governor. In the same time frame, his brother Jeb was running for governor too.
Yeah, I remember that.
Jeb lost and George W. won. And yes, a lot of people were surprised that George W. Bush won and became the governor of Texas. And I doubt that any of them would have said there is a path to the White House for George W. Bush. But he found the path and stayed on it thanks to the discipline he had, I think, around a lot of things, including faith.
Yeah, I think it seemed to me, I love both President Bush 41 and President Bush 43. And I was one of the greatest privileges in my life to work for 41. 41 expressed his faith differently than 43. 43, I think, was more open about his faith. Clearly, 41 had a strong and abiding faith. I saw it in his character and the way he carried himself and how he treated people, how he loved his neighbor like he loved himself. 43 was very open about his faith. Tell me about how that impacted the White House, and certainly how, even in the midst of 9/11 and the
Sure.
challenges that it brought, what did that mean for life in the White House, and how did it affect the people around him and you?
Well, the temperament and discipline of the president helps give discipline and temperament, the right temperament, to the White House staff. So a president really kind of becomes the model of good behavior or behavior in the White House. If the president doesn't act with good behavior, people on the White House staff don't act with good behavior. George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush really personified, I'm going to say, noble public service, and they invited us all to strive to be noble public servants working at the White House for him. But I was a witness. One of the great privileges of a chief of staff is you get to greet the president when they come to work every morning. And what a privilege it is to get out of the Oval Office as the president is coming in from the Rose Garden, and he opens the door and you say, "Good morning, Mr. President. It's a great day. I'm so glad you're president of the United States." Top of the morning. I always would greet the president with optimism. No matter how bad the day was, I said it was a great day because I didn't want him to make decisions as a pessimist. I wanted him to make decisions as an optimist. Follow me and things will be better. Can you imagine being in a position where they say, "Follow me and things are going to get worse"? No, you got to be an optimist. So I said, top of the morning, and what a privilege it was to do that. But I want to tell you that he would walk into that Oval Office, and sitting right on the top of his desk was a document that everybody in Washington wants to see, the President's Daily Brief. It's the report from the Central Intelligence Agency about all the challenges around the world. And it's a top secret document, and very few people get it. The Chief of Staff gets it, so I would have read it because my job was to read everything before it got to the President's desk. But that would be sitting there, and most people would get to work and go right to that document and open it up. President Bush would walk into the Oval Office after I greeted him, and he would sit down at the desk and open a drawer to his right and take out of it 2 devotionals and a Bible. And the first things he would read would be the devotionals, and then he would read something from the Bible. He didn't talk about it. He didn't have me stand there listening to him read out loud, but that's what he would do. And after he had done that, he would fold the books back up, put the Bible and the devotionals back in the drawer, sit back in his chair, and then open the President's Daily Brief and see what the world was like. Wow. So the discipline of faith helped give George W. Bush the discipline to be well-centered before he entered the challenging day. And he did that every single day. That was not an occasional experience. That was an everyday experience for him. And it wasn't even a big deal. And yes, he wore his faith a little more publicly than George H.W. Bush. That's because he gives credit for his accepting faith, for helping him to get on the right path, to stop drinking, to be more disciplined about his life. And once he found that discipline, he was infected by it in a nice way. And so, yes, he told people about his faith. And he was very active in his church and continues to be active in church today.
Well, he gave all of us the strong sense, without forcing his faith down anybody's throat, that he was praying as well for God's protection for our country. And that leadership was so wonderful in that difficult time. That was one of the scariest times for all of us as Americans. And when those towers came down, and his calm, his resolve, the strength of his faith was just a blessing for this great nation, Andy. And is there any little story that you can share with our audience, even if it's funny, about your time in the White House with this great man of faith?
Well, first of all, I can't imagine being a president making brutally tough decisions without being grounded in faith. And it's not for me to determine what that faith should be. You know, I happen to be a Christian. I'm glad to be a Christian. But I just think you've got to have faith. You've got to believe that we are a nation under God and you can't do it alone. And so faith is critically important. I watched as George W. Bush counted on his faith to help give him strength and help motivate his direction, so that it's very easy to be seduced by others when you're the president of the United States. And it's easy for a president to seduce others. And he was disciplined about not being seduced by others and not trying to seduce others to do something that was wrong. He was very well grounded. But I would say he also had a lot of levity to him. And he knew that during times of stress, sometimes you also need to have an opportunity to laugh and to and to tell a joke or be, heckled or something, just making it fun and human, and he did. But I will tell you, on 9/11, he was so disciplined. I whispered in his ear, and I said to him, a second plane hit the second tower, America is under attack. He did not know about the second plane. Before he walked into that classroom at the Emma E. Booker School, he had been told it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. That's what he was told before he walked into that classroom. I was then told it wasn't a small twin-engine prop plane, it was a commercial jetliner. Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower. I had to make a decision to tell him. I made a decision not to have a conversation with him, but to pass on two facts and make one editorial comment, and to do nothing to invite a conversation, because I presumed there was a boom microphone hanging over his head, and I didn't want him to have a conversation with me in front of the media. I also knew he was sitting in front of second graders and a press pool. And I was very impressed that when I came up to him and said, a second plane hit the second tower, America is under attack, he did nothing to introduce fear to those young second graders, and he did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. And instead, I think that was the day he realized the great responsibility that he accepted when he took the oath to be president of the United States, to preserve, protect, and defend. That's the oath. And yes, he came to office thinking he was going to be a president focused mostly on domestic issues. He had to focus on national security issues and our Constitution that put him in charge of protecting us. And I was a witness to the discipline he had. But I will tell you, on the flight from Sarasota, Florida, to Barksdale Air Force Base, the president was agitating to saying that we were going back to Washington, D.C. And he kept telling me we're going back to Washington, D.C. I was talking to the pilot, and he was saying, I'm not going back to Washington, D.C. if I don't think we can land at Andrews Air Force Base. The Secret Service says we can't go back to Washington, D.C. if it's not going to be safe for us to get out of the plane and go over to the White House. And so I kept telling the president, I understand that, Mr. President. I don't think you want to make that decision right now. And he didn't like me saying that. And he kept saying, I am making the decision. We're going back to Washington, D.C. right now. And I said, yes, but I don't think you want to make that decision right now. And I was very strong, but very polite and very firm. And I didn't get support from the Secret Service in the president's presence, but they were all cheering me on from outside. And the president started yelling and screaming at me, and I just held my ground. And I actually wrestled with is the president telling me he wants to go back to Washington, D.C. as the commander-in-chief, or is he telling me because he wants to go back as the political leader of this country, the president of the United States? And I rationalized that he was not making that decision as commander-in-chief because he had all the tools to be commander-in-chief on Air Force One, and we were going to go to Stratcom in Omaha, Nebraska, where they had all the tools. And that he was just making it because he wanted to be at the White House. He wanted the people to see him at the White House. And I said, you might not be safe there. So I held my ground, and he was very angry with me, very, very angry. We ended up going back to Washington, D.C. after we went to Stratcom and got there about 7:30 at night that night. And he was still angry at me. About 2 months later, I'm in the limousine with him coming back from an event at the Pentagon. And he leans over to me and he says, I really want to apologize how I acted on Air Force One. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I think I was a little tough on you on Air Force One. And I'm saying, I don't know what you're talking about. He says, on 9/11. And so he apologized to me.
Yeah.
But he is still a very compassionate, thoughtful person who has great concern, empathy, and care for everybody. And that's the important thing that I like to witness about what he does and how he does it. But I could tell you all kinds of stories and jokes about George W. Bush and the fun he had, but it's more important for us to recognize the president of the United States is the president of everybody in the United States. And you remember George W. Bush was elected in a very controversial election and went to the Supreme Court. And the nation was very divided when he took that oath of office. His performance on 9/11 helped unify us as a nation. And people didn't think of themselves on 9/11 as Republicans or Democrat or liberals or conservatives. No, we were all Americans. And we came together, and President Bush demonstrated phenomenal leadership of tolerance, acceptance, inclusiveness, and resolve.
Yeah.
And you remember that he helped bridge the divide between faiths.
Yes, he did.
And said, we're all in this together.
Well, Andy, I'm just so glad that that the Almighty saw fit to shape your life and to have you placed there right next to the President of the United States, especially in those important and fateful days. And there couldn't have been a better person standing next to the President of the United States than you, Andy Card. So I thank God for you and for your service to the country, for your love of God and country, and for all that you've done in service to the people of these great United States. I could talk to you forever, Andy, but I think we're.
Talk to you, and I've talked so much, Joe, but it's a privilege to be with you. I love this country. I love the fact that we can practice our faith and do it proudly. And I invite everyone to acknowledge the reality that we can't do it alone.
Amen.
We have faith.
Amen. Thank you so much, Secretary Andy Card. We'll be right back.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
Great to talk to Secretary Andy Card. Now we're going to talk with our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Joe, what was that interview? It was on so many levels very moving. I think the scene that probably stood out to me is thinking about President Bush having that daily briefing, intelligence briefing on his desk, but then first reaching for his devotional book and his Bible to read a passage of Scripture. And I know some people say, well, a president's decisions can be divided from their faith, and they can make decisions just kind of on their intuition or their common sense. And what Secretary Card was saying again and again is, no. You have to have a leader grounded in something, because at some point there will be a moment of testing and trial that will blow up your personal systems. And if you don't have a grounding rooted in something permanent, faith, you're going to evaporate in a moment of trial.
Yeah, well, you could see it was real for George W. Bush. I mean, this was a real thing, this faith. I mean, reading the scriptures and praying was real for him. Just a blessing.
Are you committing to getting up at 4:08 in the morning?
Not yet.
No.
Working on that.
Well, we'll see where that goes. Well, I mean, that was amazing, too. I was taking a lot of notes, and what an encouragement, I think, in a time of when we're looking towards the inaugural of what does this next presidency look like the next 4 years. We do want that president waking up with people surrounding him who are like Andy Card.
Absolutely. Well, this is great. Well, thank you for making time to be with us on State of Independence. Each week we try to find ways to help you in your own life, learn how to trust God more deeply, to love your neighbor more fully, and to become a light in the darkness. If you have a minute, drop me a line in the comment box at joewatkins.net. I see every one of them and I'll respond. Special thanks to my friend Secretary Andrew Card for the life of service to others and faith that has inspired so many to follow in his footsteps. Until next time, God bless you, and thanks for watching.
I hope he writes a book.
Who, Andy?
Yeah.
Oh, that would be wonderful for the family. He wouldn't do anything to embarrass anybody,
Right.
especially not for money.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.